to the second meeting of this year for Prince William Sound Audubon. I'm Mary Ann Bishop, for those of you who don't know me, president of the Audubon Society. Milo's our vice president. He's in Western Australia right now, finding lizards and snakes, and with Paula. And Kate is off in Anchorage, so it's just me here tonight to handle this. And welcome, Scott. Have a seat. And so before I forget, next month, Erin Bowman's going to be speaking about Fukushima. Erin's here, right? And that is going to be the 19th of November, so the week before Thanksgiving. And he's going to talk about the effects of the typhoon, not the typhoon, that just happened, right? The effects of the earthquake, tsunami at Fukushima in Japan, so that should be really interesting. And then on December 14th, we're doing our Christmas bird count. We'll meet at the Cordova Center like we have in the past. This year, though, it might not be the education room. It might be downstairs, but we'll have, the coffee and food and all that, and assign the routes. So put that on your calendar, please. Audubon's I went to a couple meetings to do with the Controller Bay, Catala, the desire for Cassandra Energy to operation. We were involved with CDFU, the Yak Preservation Council, and the Marketing Association. And CDFU has put together a really nice fact sheet. And here's a map I'll leave up here. You can all see where they're proposing to open up. And the whole thing about it is it's not just on land. They can do directional drilling, go out under in the water, including into the area that is a conservation area with the state. So we're very concerned about this in terms of birds, speaking from my own personal research that I've done in the past with the Forest Service and now with the Science Center. Controller Bay area is pretty much the first landfall for a lot of shorebirds. I mean, typically about 25 to 50% of the species stopping here, that's where they first stop. A lot of them, that's the only place they stop before moving on. Some of them will then keep hopping across the delta. A study done by USGS found, I think pretty much all of them marbled godwits that were coming through stopped there at Controller Bay. A high percentage of them stopping at Controller Bay, and the same thing with Western Sandpipers and Dunlin. So, we're concerned it's not the kind of area we can afford to have an oil spill at. So here's information on the action alert, and if you want more information, I'll leave this up here. You can put your name down and I'll email you some information or a link. But the deadline for comments is, Kristen, remind me, November 4th. Yeah, the Watershed Project was involved with that too, this whole thing. So the information's up here. Did you want to say anything about it, Kristen, about Controller Bay?
Gosh, I don't have much off the top of my head, but CDFU Chelsea Caseman has some great materials, some great talking points put together.
Right, and I brought those tonight, and then I'm assuming they're on their website too?
Yes.
Yeah, and then if you want any pointers on birds, but it's one of these things, I think you can post your comments online, and if you post anything, if you send anything in, they have to respond. I mean, they have to include you in their comments when they're responding. Everybody who writes, they have to have a response to. So pass a resolution opposing this oil and gas exploration. So it's been kind of a big effort on the part of Cordovans to oppose it, and so anything you all can do to write letters would be appreciated. So get the business out of the way, and we'll do our, come on in, Tori, there's room somewhere up front. We also typically open, when we have our meetings, ask for interesting bird sightings, and I'll kick off with my one interesting sighting, which was Sunday at 4 o'clock, which kind of shocked me, but there they were, and heading east, obviously. So does anybody else have anything? Aaron, I'll start with you, or Pete?
Yeah, I had some snows come through Whiteshed, probably around 2 o'clock on Sunday, about 30, and then cacklers, 2 different flocks, probably Anchorage town geese come through, and there were a few Tundra Swans, and a few trumpeters, and trumpeters have been coming through the last couple of days also. So been really late for both those, or all three of those species.
Last year, we had that one day in October where hundreds of swans came through, and I haven't seen an equivalent this year. Is anybody? I might have missed it. You know, it seemed like that first good freeze or whatever, suddenly there were
Yeah.
hundreds coming through.
There was a big storm in 1972 when I was on the Delta for the first time, and October 2nd it broke. So in the afternoon there were 1,500 snow geese, 200 snow geese, 1,500 Tundra Swans, 46 flocks. All in 2 hours, it just came pouring through that Tiedemann Slough.
Mm-hmm. So a big storm will do it.
Yeah.
And we've got a big storm supposedly, I think, coming in tomorrow or
Yeah, tomorrow and the next day.
tonight. Open your windows, maybe we'll hear some geese flying over. So, do you have any other?
No.
Aaron?
Some Bohemian waxwing. Yeah, just a couple flying over in this area, and some more over in the Saddlebag.
Bill?
No, I haven't been around town all that much lately, but I was over on the Kenai Peninsula on the Resurrection Pass Trail lately, and super high numbers of white-winged crossbills.
Yeah, here too.
Yeah, must have been a good nesting season, and also spruce grouse. They were everywhere. It was one of the highest densities I've ever seen, and they're always higher density over on the Kenai versus here, but I spent quite a bit of time on the Kenai over the years, and they must have also had a very good nesting season.
Yeah, I think after the year before, when there were no berries and things like that, like this past summer,
We had
John.
about 200 bufflehead ducks and golden eyes in the lake at Final 3 days ago.
Oh, nice, nice. Danny?
I'm just curious, we kind of didn't we have a nesting failure with our gulls within the last year or two where there weren't much?
Oh, the past couple years until this year. This year was good
So
though.
this year was a better year.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of, end of the year you can see around now this year, whereas, yeah, so,
I noticed when I was down at Wingham Island, there's a gull rooker, kittiwake rookery on a rock there that was almost deserted last year. And this year it was stuffed, but I wasn't sure if that correlated to the other.
yeah, I think there, the blob was this warm water that, especially, started, I want to say the winter of 14, 15, and by 16 we were really seeing the results, like there was, for example, out at Kokonenik, and still with the gulls, I'd say it was low numbers in 17 and 18, and then this year came back, but we're going through another warm water phase right now. People are concerned. It's going to depend on if it keeps up this winter or not. If it keeps up this winter, I think we're going to see another round of failures, but if it dissipates, if we get enough good storms that really mix that water, we should hopefully have another normal year like this year. Anybody else with some sightings or anything?
Saw
Yes,
a couple
Kris.
northern harriers about a week ago.
Oh, nice. I was been passing through then. Good. Good. Okay, well, tonight, this is a talk I've been waiting for. I started bugging Kris about this, I don't know, about 8 months ago when I heard he'd gone there. Full disclosure, I went there 48 years ago, and so I'm sure it's changed a lot. When I was there were just a couple of what they called the monos, the Spanish word for the statues, and including the little group in the middle of the island. There were, 7 or 9 of those. It was those and about 3 on the outside, so I think it's probably changed quite a bit. There's probably more that have been dug up and raised, so.
About 900.
900. So anyway, Kris went there for school. It was tied in with your school, but you'll have to tell him the rest because I never did find out the rest except that you went. So take it away, Kris.
Okay, so we're going to be discussing the past ecology on Rapa Nui, also called Easter Island. This will mainly be a discussion of historiography, which is the study of. So a little.
Lights turned down, or?
That can be managed. Okay, so a little about me. I'm Kris Ranney, for any of you who don't know. I traveled to Rapa Nui in 2017 as part of an archaeological field school with the University of Oregon. And we were investigating a possible correlation between lithic monument volume and possible. The expedition was headed by Professor Terry Hunt, who was the Dean of the Honors College at the University of Oregon. Currently, he's the Dean of the Honors College at the University of Arizona. And his work is where I derive a lot of my information. So, before we get going into the ecology of the island, primarily we're going to be talking about how human impact has shaped the ecology of Rapa Nui. So we should discuss when exactly it was habitated. Eastern Polynesia was one of the last land masses that was habitated by humans. It was in a real big wave of habitation at about 12,000 CE.
1,200.
1200, yeah, sorry about that. And that was coming in from Western Polynesia, which is Samoa, Tonga. And the interesting thing, settled once. It was probably only reached the one time. It has a very small genetic diversity. There is no sign of trade with the other Polynesian islands. By the time of European contact, many of the Western Polynesian islands were very isolated, but there is a lot of evidence that there was substantial trade and cultural contact between the islands up for several hundred years after their initial habitation. There is no evidence. So a little background as to island ecology. Typically, islands are, they have a very small ecological diversity compared to mainland habitats. This is because a small number of organisms can become very dominant and evolve to change to fill different niches over time rather than having new organisms move in and fill those niches. This does make them very vulnerable to new conditions, however. Rapa Nui, for example, it only had a few hundred plant species before human habitation, and no large animals. It had some insects, some crustaceans, some land crabs, and a few species of birds, including one species of falcon, which was the only real large predator. One of the things that the island is really well known for was having very large palm forests. It is unknown exactly how extensive they are. They very well might have been limited to the island peaks, and it may have fluctuated quite significantly over the island's history. The palms were probably very closely related to the Chilean wine palm, which is the second largest species of palm in the world. They grow to about 80 feet tall and have a at the base of between 6 and 8 feet. So a very large tree.
Why are they called wine palms?
I actually do not know.
They don't produce wine?
You fall out, you start whining.
Yeah, they actually produce very small nuts, about an inch in diameter. So I'm not actually sure why they're called wine palms. So another thing, okay, so now let's get into one of the predominant narratives of Rapa Nui changing of ecology after human habitation, which is the collapse narrative. The collapse narrative, it has existed in our understanding of Rapa Nui history pretty much ever since European contact. It was James Cook, who was one of the explorers who first documented Rapa Nui. He proposed that it might have, something along these lines might have happened. Basically what the collapse narrative is that the islanders, they reached the island and they used the resources in great abundance, eventually outstripping its ability to regenerate, thus destroying the island's carrying capacity. This was really popularized by a noted ecologist, Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He also wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. And the basic scenario is that the island had a population of between 30 and 40,000 people, and then subsequently crashed to a couple hundred people within a very short time scale. Yeah, and so, and one of the main scenarios that is brought up in the collapse narrative quite often is the cutting down of those palm forests.
So none of them, they had no boats or any type of water transportation to move?
I will get to that.
Okay.
So one of the main things that's proposed as use for the palm lumber is the construction of the Moai, which are the Easter Island statues, also called the Easter Island heads, although, as you can see, they aren't just heads, but semantics. The Moai are a very important part of Rapa Nui culture. As I stated previously, there are over 900 statues currently counted on the island. There very well might be more. Some of the ahu, which are the platforms that they're built on top of, have been excavated, and there have been fragments of Moai statues found inside the platforms. So what we're pretty sure is happening is soft rock. It's called volcanic tuff. It's basically compacted ash. And so as they weather away and collapse, they're incorporated into the platform, and new ones are erected on top of them. So the Moai, they are representations of ancestral spirits that are guarding various communities. The Rapa Nui, they weren't a monolithic group, we're pretty sure. They were various communities for resources. And the Moai were probably a pretty big part of that. Right now, we're pretty sure that they served as a kind of honest indicator, which is a term in ecology that it's basically like, peacocks, they have their big feathers. It's something that an organism has to put a lot of energy into and can't really be faked. Like a peacock that doesn't have the energy to, and thus any peahen that's looking at them knows that they don't have a lot of energy to spare. Same thing goes with the Moai statues. What we're pretty sure is that they were a symbol of how much water resources the various islanders had at their disposal, because water is very scarce on this island. A lot of the water comes from tidal seeps. Basically, you wait for low tide, go out onto the beach, see the water that's seeping down. It's very brackish, not particularly good quality, but it's what you gotta do. Yeah, and so it also would have served as a way to use up excess energy when you have excess resources, instead of putting that energy towards building up your population. So that way when that excess resources plummets again, you don't have a die-off. So there are some problems with the collapse narrative that we got a little bit into with discussion of the Moai. Another main problem is the palms, these palm forests. They, I'm not sure, have any of you ever cut down a palm tree? They're not actually a tree. They're actually very closely related to grass. They have a very spongy wood. So they wouldn't have made very good rollers for moving these giant statues around. These statues, they can weigh over 40 tons. So wouldn't have been great for moving these statues around. They also would not have made very good canoes, which is the other thing that the collapse narrative often brings up, is that when they cut down all these trees, they isolated themselves and were unable to evacuate the island. But truthfully, as soon as they got to the island, they were basically cut off because there were no large trees. There was no timber that was very suitable for making these oceanic vessels. The Rapa Nui, they did have boats. They maxed out at about 2 meters long. They were 2-man crafts, 1 person for paddling, 1 person for bailing, because reportedly they leaked like a sieve, because they didn't have any good caulking material. Another big problem with the collapse narrative on the island, they got that information by comparing it with other Polynesian islands and gauging their population off of that. Unfortunately, Rapa Nui isn't really like a lot of the other Polynesian islands. You kind of have an image of a tropical island, but Rapa Nui is actually subtropical. And one of the big effects of that is it doesn't have a coral reef. As the island weathered down, because it is a few million years old and has weathered down significantly, as it has weathered down, it's gotten significantly smaller. A lot of that really rich volcanic soil has leached away, and none of it was caught up in that marine ecosystem that is associated with these coral reefs. The Rapa Nui used very little marine resources. Probably less than 5% of their diet was derived from marine resources. And the soil, like I was saying, is very poor in nutritional quality. In particular, it has very little nitrogen in the soil. So they would have to have used various farming techniques like lithic mulching, if any of you are familiar with that. That's basically where you take rocks and put them in your field, and as rain falls on the rock, it leaches minerals out. Labor intensive and not particularly effective. It is just effective enough to be worth doing. It also serves the double benefit of stabilizing the soil temperature because it absorbs the heat of the sun and dissipates it during the cold of the night, and thus stabilizes your soil. They would have also have built various enclosures such as manavai, which are what these are. Take all of your organic waste and put them in these enclosures, and then you'd be able to grow your more nutrient-demanding crops, such as bananas. And so that does raise another problem with the collapse narrative, which is that the Polynesians were agriculturalists. There's only one large Polynesian society that were not. Those were the Maori of New Zealand. But other than that, they were agriculturalists. They grew toro, sweet potatoes, bananas. They raised chickens. Most of them raised pigs, not on Rapa Nui. They went extinct within a couple hundred years of the island's habitation. So yeah, they were agriculturalists. studies have shown that a pure hunter-gatherer society on Rapa Nui would have probably only been able to, the carrying capacity would have probably been able to subsist on the palm nuts from the palm forests. So you cut them down, you burn them, you make agricultural fields. Makes sense. Another major component of the collapse of the palm forests were the introduction of the Polynesian rat, which was probably brought along as a source of quick protein. Yes. There isn't a lot of evidence that they were actively consumed, but they were brought to just about every island in Polynesia. And these canoes were very large, certainly larger than the term canoe really postulates, but it would be pretty easy to eradicate a pest if you put your mind to it. So they were probably brought along intentionally. And they do reproduce and grow very quickly, so they would have been a fairly easy source of protein. And so when they did reach Rapa Nui, they would have been released onto the island. And studies have shown that rat populations can double in a matter of months. So within a few years, the rat population on Rapa Nui could have been in the millions. And that is a lot of the other plants on Rapa Nui. They had very long germination and growth periods. Like the giant palm probably took a couple hundred years to reach maturity. And that's just because they were growing in such nutrient-poor conditions. So you introduce a type of predator, for lack of a better term, onto the island that they had no defenses against. Recall, there were no toothed animals. Having them introduced onto the island, they could absolutely destroy a lot of these plants' ability to reproduce successfully. So a lot of, when the Dutch explorers first reached the island in 1720, they actually report seeing palm trees at the tops of these mountains. They were probably some of the same individuals that were growing there when the Polynesians first arrived. It is very likely that there were no new in between when the Polynesians arrived and when the Dutch arrived. Rats were probably very easily curtailing their ability to reproduce. This has been shown on a number of historic cases. There's a couple islands off the coast of New Zealand that rats were introduced to relatively recently, I believe back in the 60s. And within a couple decades, the makeup of foliage on the islands it was unrecognizable. Which plants were dominant had fundamentally shifted. So that does raise the question, if the Rapa Nui did not kill themselves in this collapse, then how did they die? Because by the time James Cook arrived, which was in 1774, he estimated the population of the island to be around 300 people. So what happened? The answer is somewhat, obviously, epidemic. It is a story that has been seen throughout the world as Europeans have gone about exploring new lands. They have brought many diseases with them. The main one that we have a lot of evidence for on Rapa Nui is syphilis, which was probably introduced by the Dutch in 1722. That's the one that really shows up on skeletal remains, but they probably also brought other diseases like measles and smallpox, which absolutely decimated the population. Currently, the Rapa Nui's population has bounced back significantly. It is up to about 3,500 individuals, which is probably actually fairly historic. The maximum population that the island reached historically was probably about 6,000 individuals, based on current understandings of the island's carrying capacity. So, any questions? By the way, this is the harbor on the island, which I find quite cool.
What's the average rainfall there?
It is very arid. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think something like 20 inches. And it isn't very consistent.
Is there any evidence of Chinese explorers reaching Rapa Nui?
Not to my knowledge. There is some speculation that there would have been contact between Rapa Nui and South America. We're pretty sure at this point that it's actually the Polynesians who were traveling to South America. There's some striking similarities between a particular archaeological site on Rapa Nui, which is actually, I think that no, I don't have it. But there is a pretty striking similarity between one of the archaeological sites on Rapa Nui and Incan architecture. But it is very superficial, so it very well might have just been coincidental.
So explain again why the statues. I mean, when I was there, we sort of thought it was because people didn't have much else to do, and it is this kind of volcanic island. So how did they get those moas to where they got them? Do they know how they moved them there? And
we're pretty sure we know how they moved them. It was actually my professor Terry Hunt. He came up with an idea that I think is pretty compelling and somewhat conclusive, which is basically you walk them. You take a cord and you wrap it around the top of the statue, and you kind of tilt it over, and it kind of gets going over this way, and then you tilt it back the other way. It goes like that, and you walk it all the way over.
because I think what they call the factory or whatever was quite a ways from where these were moved to, right?
Yeah, I think maximum was about 8 miles, which is, yeah, quite a ways.
And they were built over how many hundreds of years, the Moais?
About 600 years.
Mm-hmm.
Between, like 500 years. Although it is unclear just how long of a period they would have been constructed over. By the time of European contact, we're pretty sure they had stopped building them. At least the Dutch never made any mention of any under construction, although they were only there for 2 days, so, you know.
But were they still standing there?
Yeah.
Because weren't some of them knocked over in the Civil War?
No, we're pretty sure that never really occurred. That stems from when some Jesuit missionaries came to the island. They made mention of the islanders being cannibals, everyone that they didn't like cannibals. Like I was saying, the rock is a volcanic tuff. It weathers very quickly, and indeed. So the statues, they had to be very meticulously cared for in order to keep them upright. And like I was saying at the start, when talking about their incorporation into the plateau topple, and they build new ones on top of them over the course of the island's history. So the period, we know that they were standing when the Dutch arrived, and some of them were still standing when a Spanish expedition arrived 2 years before Captain Cook. and they were all down by the time Captain Cook arrived. So he postulated that they were probably toppled in some kind of religious reform, collapsed naturally, either due to gradual weathering or some kind of earthquake or tsunami event.
But the reasoning to build them was more to show who was healthy.
Basically. I mean, there were obviously cultural implications that have to be taken into account, but archaeologists these days are trying to become as scientific as possible, so they try not to talk about emotions and that kind of thing. So there's a lot to do with various ecological mechanisms, such as honest indicators, and then what's the other one? Costly signaling, which is a similar mechanism.
And when I was there, the couple that were up were right on the edge of the ocean, you know, and then there were the ones that kind of sat in the middle, that one little group.
Yeah, so
now, with the 900, where were they? Were they just along the edge primarily?
They're primarily along the edge because that's where most of the settlements were. Because like I said, the vast majority of the freshwater resources are from these tidal seeps. So that's where settlements would have to be to take advantage of that. There are some other freshwater resources in underground caves, but they're significantly less common. The ones clustered towards the center, that's where the quarry was, where they were constructed. And those are what are called the road moai. There are actually a number of them scattered throughout the this moai right here, that's toppled face down. That's one of the road moai, which is actually, interestingly enough, you can see this little crevice down here. Someone after it fell over and before the present has dug out a hollow underneath it to create a shelter from the wind and the rain. But they're upright, you swing them back and forth, you walk them along. If they fall over, there's no way to really get them back upright. So falls over and you leave it.
But most of them, they were produced in an almost lying position. Couldn't they just be rolled over the fields to the sea?
What's that?
Most of the moai, they were built in an almost lying position, not upright.
Yeah, so are you talking about in the quarry?
Yeah.
They constructed them laying down, and then they would push them down and put them into this, they basically hoist them over and put them into this trough, where they'd lower them down the side of this hill, because they were constructed up on top of this, this cliff basically. And they'd put them down into this trough and lower them down. And that's actually where the Easter Island heads come from, is because a lot of the ones that were constructed didn't really a fairly specific geometry to actually be moved like that. They basically had to have the physical makeup of like a bowling pin. So if they were too top heavy or didn't have the right proportions in other ways, they just abandoned them. And the troughs would fill in, and all that would be left sticking out of the soil was the head. Yeah, and so that's how they get them upright.
But some of them had those little like stone hats.
Yeah, the pukao.
On the right.
Indeed. Yeah, those are made out of a different type of volcanic stone. Getting its name off the top of my head, but yeah, it's a red volcanic stone. And they were these cylindrical hats, basically. And what they do, we're pretty sure at this point, is they build these big stone ramps going up to the Moai after they got it onto the platform before they tilted it backward and got it into its final shape. Because there was actually a substantial amount of shaping that was done after they got it to the platform. They build this stone ramp up to it and do something called parbuckling, which is something else. And they hoist the hat up on top of its head that way.
And do you know what the meaning was, or do they know what the meaning was if it had a hat?
Look what we can do. It seems to have been a later innovation. The Rapa Nui, they were substantial lithic monument builders. They moved a lot of rock. In the lithic mulching, they actually moved a substantial, quite a few more tons of rock doing that than any kind of lithic monuments that they were building in the Moai or the Ahu. They also built these truly gigantic, what we're pretty sure are chicken coops. If the island didn't have the Moai, it would probably be known as the island of giant chicken coops. They also,
What are the dimensions of the island and what's the current economy to support 3,500 people?
the island is about 12 miles across at its widest point. I think 8 at its narrowest. It's shaped kind of like a triangle. It is primarily a tourism economy. The permanent population of the island is about 7,000, about 3,500 Rapa Nui, and then Chilean immigrants primarily. It's a province of Chile. And so, primarily tourism.
So, that was one of my questions. I had 2 others, and I can only remember. How long did you get to spend on the island?
I was on the island for about a month.
About a month. Okay. And, the other question was, wasn't there a NOVA program that shows that moving of the Moai that you described?
Yeah, that was with my professor.
With your professor,
Yeah, he had a lot of horror stories about getting that together.
I imagine. I'm not a big NOVA fan actually, but I think that was what it was.
Yeah, because he had to get everything together, and because he had this idea of this is how they might have been worked just based on the computer modeling of their dimensions, but he'd never actually tried it before because the days where archaeologists could just show up on the island and mess around with their statues have long passed. So he'd never actually tried this theory out. So we'll ship it to you and you can move it, and you have 3 days. So he had to get a whole bunch of volunteers together and try to move this thing without really knowing exactly how they were going to do it. So it was interesting.
Did you guys talk at all during your class about Thor Heyerdahl and his whole Kon-Tiki thing? So I remember hearing stories about that when I went there.
Yeah, basically the consensus on Thor Heyerdahl is he was very important for raising awareness of Pacific archaeology. His ideas were bogus, hold up, and actually are rather racist if you actually look at them. He thought that all civilization stemmed from Norway, and it moved down to Egypt, and then it moved to South America, and then it moved to Easter Island. And that's where it all came from. They've tried to redo his famous Kon-Tiki expedition in more recent years, but they haven't actually been able to reproduce it because what they're pretty sure is he had his raft towed out about 200 miles from the Chilean coastline. They've tried launching expeditions from the coast, and they always get caught up in the coastal currents and get swept south rather than being swept west. It was a fairly interesting idea because there is substantial evidence that there was contact between the Polynesians and the South Americans, primarily because one of the staples of Polynesian cuisine is the sweet potato, which is native to South America. Also, the word, can't remember the word off the top of my head, but the word that for sweet potato in various Andean dialects is almost identical to the word for sweet potato in almost all of the Polynesian languages.
But isn't it like a little strange that they would be able to sail from Polynesia to, or canoe from Polynesia to South America, like against the southeast trade winds and against the currents?
That is actually the primary
Because-
settle as much as they could, because it's here. What is the term? It's basically they were using that predominant wind and current as a way to ensure their voyaging. So they knew that they could set out and they could sail as far as they could, and if they didn't find anything, they could turn around and they'd be back home in no time. That's a settlement very quickly, is because you could do these voyages without worrying too much about not being able to get back home. Like we hear canoe, and it raises an image of a fairly ramshackle oceanic vessel. These vessels were huge. They were over 100 feet long, very able sailing craft. There's been a lot of work done to simulate. They were almost certainly able to sail against the wind with a lot of capacity. A voyage from Tahiti to South America, they probably would have been able to do in about between 2 and 3 weeks, which is, impressive. It's a very very impressive. They were a seafaring civilization.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
I have two questions. Were the Rapa Nuians subject to slavery?
Yes. Are you talking about in prehistory or history?
Not prehistory.
Prehistory, there isn't a lot of evidence for that. It's a hard thing to really gauge. It exists in some of their oral histories, but it is unclear just how much that was influenced by contact with Tahiti. There wasn't a lot of anthropologists in the area until after there was substantial contact between Rapa Nui and Tahiti. So the fact that a lot of their stories are very similar could mean that there wasn't a lot of cultural drift, or it could mean Tahiti's cultural influence became very strong very quickly. It's unclear. Afterward, there was substantial slave trade between, substantial not in terms of duration, it only lasted about a year, but the Peruvian slave trade, and that's what was during the period called blackbirding. If you're interested in that, it's a very fascinating and somewhat grotesque period in history.
What
That was the
year
guano.
that?
The guano, right?
Yeah, that was for the guano mines off the coast of Peru. And that was in the 1860s, I believe. Yeah, if you're interested, it's basically what happened was Spain decided to get laborers from Polynesia to offset their labor shortages, and a lot of the vessels that were tasked with going and recruiting laborers took that to mean that they could just kidnap people, and it pretty near decimated the eastern Polynesian populations. Yeah.
Do they still have the rat problem, and are they able, with their agriculture, with access to modern agriculture methods?
So they do have rats. They do not have Polynesian rats. They've pretty near been replaced by black rats and Norwegian rats. There isn't really that much agriculture on the island anymore. Their economy is almost entirely based around tourism. There are a few farms on the island that are somewhat successful. The main thing that is raised on the island is actually horses, which is somewhat confusing, but the native islanders actually predominantly use horses as their means of transportation. And the number of horses that you own is kind of how you determine your status on the island, even though in modern times they don't really serve a purpose. But yeah, kind of an interesting little thing. Yeah.
There's been modern attempts to disprove sailing from successful attempts to sail from Tahiti.
Oh yeah, quite a few. Either from Tahiti or Hawaii, or in the Micronesia. There's a it's what's called the Polynesian Renaissance. It started back in about the 1970s. And a number of reconstruction voyaging canoes were built, and one actually recently completed a circumnavigation of the Earth. They were all current data suggests that they were incredibly capable sailing vessels.
Well, my brother was kind of famous for his barbecued rat down in Panama jungle training
Indeed.
for Vietnam. And I was wondering, did they eat the rats? They're delicious, he told me.
Yeah, there is a significant cultural taboo against eating rats. So it is, there isn't a substantial amount of evidence that they actually were eaten. They don't appear in very many mizzen pits. So if they were eaten, it was probably seen as a last resort type thing. But just the fact that they did arrive on the island does indicate that they were brought along for some reason, and that's kind of the most obvious reason.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you. That was very interesting.